Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much indeed for allowing me the opportunity to present at this doctoral colloquium on my proposed thesis subject, a conceptual business incubator framework for junior mineral exploration and development, a Southern African perspective. My presentation is going to take four major parts. The first part is the context, as I feel it's important to actually reiterate this, which comes from chapter 1 being the proposal, before I leap straight into the literature review, which concludes with a proposed conceptual framework, research gaps and shortcomings. I then move on to part 3, being the research methodology, before making some concluding remarks. So moving straight into part 1, the context. So here I want to explain the global context and the rationale for me doing this study. Firstly, critical minerals demand to meet most sustainable development scenarios, and even the most conservative of all of them, far exceeds supply at the moment. Importantly, Africa hosts over 30% of critical minerals supply. Now here is the interesting one. 60% of discoveries are made by junior companies, of which 90% fail before commercial success. However, if you belong to one of the integrated mining incubators, and I've named the 3 which exist, the 162 group out of Ireland, and the Lundin Group and Hunter Dickinson out of Canada, they achieve 0, 0, and 12.5% failure rates respectively, which, as you can see, is a fundamental difference from the standard failure rate of 90% of juniors. And therefore, this research aims to translate all of these learnings into a Southern African centered framework to link geology, finance, social capital, and so as to improve the junior exploration success rate. So revisiting what were my problem statement, my objectives, and my research aim. My problem statement is there is an absence of a fully integrated junior mineral exploration and development incubator for junior miners in Southern Africa. And therefore my objectives are, firstly, how do you critically evaluate how juniors discover and develop mines? And then, of course, the corollary of this, determine the reasons and the extent of the shortcomings of juniors and why they fail. And then thirdly, why are the 3 integrated mining incubators more successful than standalone juniors in discovering and developing mines? And this wraps itself up in terms of the research aim being to develop a conceptual business incubator framework for junior mineral exploration and development in Southern Africa. A research thesis always starts off, particularly with Da Vinci, which I think is a wonderful thing, with ensuring philosophical congruence against your paradigm. I have a relativist ontology where reality is multiple, context dependent, and shaped by the perceptions, and in my perspective, of the entrepreneurs, investors, regulators, and communities involved in the junior mining area. My epistemology is that of an interpretivist and a constructivist, where knowledge is co-created through meaning between the researcher and the participant. And you may recall that I'm now running my 4th junior, so this work is deeply embedded in my very nature and what I do from a 9-to-5 perspective. And understanding arises from interpreting lived experiences rather than in the natural science world of measuring external phenomenon. The methodology I'm using is qualitative and inductive, where insights emerge from rich contextual evidence, primarily through interviews with serial mining entrepreneurs, and then triangulation through secondary data analysis to reveal ongoing and recurring patterns and themes. My axiology is value-bound, and that arises from my personal philosophy of being a Stoic pragmatist, where my professional experience and reflective stance shape the interpretation while remaining ethically disciplined and self-aware. Values of integrity, learning, and contribution guide this research process, which is something I live and breathe in my working environment anyway. And together, these assumptions form a coherent interpretive paradigm, which can be seen as the golden thread of my study. So if I look at this and I try and link this along with the theories I'm going to be presenting on momentarily, and then looking at it through the corresponding tips lens, the philosophy, which I've spoken about already, aligns itself with the tip lens of people, human sense-making, values, and co-creation of meaning. The theories, i.e. what explains this phenomenon, and I'm going to be drilling into this in a lot more detail in my literature study, I'll link to the tips lens of technology and innovation. The methodology, how will we study it? I've already mentioned this as well. A multi-case study, comparative design, qualitative, inductive is linked to the system lens of the TIPS framework. And finally, research method. What tools will I use? Semi-structured interviews being my primary tool, archival analysis being my secondary, and then using thematic analysis, coding, and analysis to interpret the results. And this is linked to the technology and people lens of the TIPS framework. So diving straight into the literature review, I'm firstly going to look at the evolution of business incubators in general. Clarissa defined 4 different generations of business incubator. The first generation were basically property-based or office space incubators. The second generation were enhancing this to provide support services and training. The third generation was a networked, virtual, and sector specialized models, but not sector specialized in the mining space. And the fourth one, which is emerging after COVID, are integrated digital incubators, which embed environmental, social, and governance, and in particular, impact investment. So essentially, if I look at where mining incubators fit here, they are essentially system orchestrators linking entrepreneurs, government, academia, finances, and communities. However, business incubators don't exist in isolation or in a vacuum. They exist within an entrepreneurial ecosystem, which are interconnected networks that enable innovation, resource mobilization, and venture growth. But they also exist within the concept of a network theory, in terms of how relationships act as channels for sharing resources, trust, and reputation, and in particular, raising money amongst connected participants. So looking at integrating the core theories into a unified analytical lens. And these are the core theories which I identified in terms of building a integrated mining incubator for juniors in Southern Africa. The first is the resource-based view. And the core concept here is looking at unique resources, for example, geological knowledge, which create competitive advantage. And how is competitive advantage determined? And that's looking at the VRIN, which is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable resources. RBV happens to be fairly static, and this tends to be advanced by adding dynamic capabilities, which look at how a firm modifies their resources to respond to changing environment. And typically an incubator application for this will be adaptive governance and venture scaling. And then vitally, from an entrepreneurial perspective is effectuation and bricolage. Effectuation looks at a core concept of means available, co-creation under uncertainty, and this looks at flexibility, particularly in the early stages. And then bricolage is making do by recombining resources and improvising when capital is scarce, and that's a very, very, very common thing in juniors, and I can attest to that. So how do we highlight these unique requirements within the context of the mining sector itself? And how do we differentiate the mining sector from other sectors? Firstly, there is a very high degree of technical, particularly geological, funding and commodity price uncertainty. There's very high capital intensity and long gestation periods from converting an exploration through to a mine itself. And this leads to funding gaps and risk aversion. Competitive advantage comes from tacit technical knowledge, insight, you could say, data ownership and deep experience. And then ESG and SLO, which I talk about quite a bit, being the social license to operate, essentially extend timelines and give the need for an adaptive incubation. Incubators must not only encompass all of this, but must encompass risk-sharing finance, technical oversight, and stakeholder alignment to convert this uncertainty into structured learning and ultimately commercial success. So if I compare the three integrators which I mentioned on my earlier slides and look at what's happening in Southern Africa, if I look at the structure of the three integrated incubators, they are all private. The 162 group is seen as a prospect generator, the Lundin a corporate incubator, Hunter Dickinson a venture builder, and in Southern Africa we essentially have fragmented public and university programs. If I look at the core strengths behind each of these three incubators, and they are very different. The 162 group is entrepreneurial ability and speed. The Lundin group is relational capital, and that of the Hunter Dickinson is technical integration. Southern Africa is sadly just grant and compliance orientated and sadly leads to very, very little growth. All three of the business integrators essentially look at public offerings, but the 162 group does focus a lot more on joint ventures than the other three. The learning cycle of the 162 group is typically 3 years, Lundin continuous, and the Hunter Dickinson group is partnership based. And all three of these integrators tend to adopt a portfolio approach to distribute risk, share learning, and reallocate resources. So how can we build all of this to develop a context responsive conceptual framework? And here I have proposed a framework which draws from the complex theory, which I've skated over in this presentation, looks at the three different business integrators and looks at what's going on in Southern Africa to put something that could possibly work. Firstly, it's a three ring model. The inner ring is something called the core engine, which is aligned to the TIPS lenses of technology and people. This is called capability orchestration, and this is the engine of the incubator itself and powered by RBV, dynamic capabilities, effectuation and bricolage. This builds flexibility, resourcefulness and entrepreneurial drive. The middle ring is that of an operational platform, which is aligned to the TIPS lens of innovation. And this looks at incubator mechanisms, which is supplemented by organizational learning, sharing lessons, capital, and people across ventures. And the outer ring is that of the ecosystem interface, which is aligned to the TIPS lens of systems, external embeddedness, which looks at strengthening relationships, legitimacy, and capital flow through various feedback loops to financiers, to government, to local communities. And how does this all kind of work? I like to use the analogy of an engine in that the core generates the ideas and the energy. The middle gears organize and transmit it, and the outer system turns that motion into progress and feedback, and it's a self-replicating system. So how do I link these theoretical constructs to other framework layers through TIPS? Looking at the core engine itself, This is aligned to technology people, and this essentially looks at turning a geological idea into an early stage project. The operational platform is essentially knowledge codification, experiential learning, the innovation lens of TIPS, and this is making sure that lessons, capital and people are shared across the portfolio. And finally, the outer ring, that of the ecosystem interface, looks at relational capital, legitimacy capital flows, and this is aligned to the TIPS lens of systems. So how does this proposed framework fit within other frameworks within the incubator environment? The two main frameworks are those of Clarissi and TIS. Clarissi is essentially looking at a typology of incubators in terms of their service offering. It's descriptive and it's static, and it's not in a particular domain to the mining industry itself. TIS basically builds on this RBV view of an indicator, of an incubator, by adding in dynamic capabilities, and this is limited by its theoretical and firm-centered, and it also has a weak ecosystem link. So my framework combines the best of both of these frameworks. It adds an ecosystem layer. It particularly focuses on the entrepreneurial theories of effectuation and bricolage, and it's linked to the TIPS framework to give something which is unique to the junior mining specific environment. So what are my key research gaps and shortcomings? Well, firstly, few models explaining mining specific integrated incubation. There are very few at all out there. I've demonstrated that. Incubation systems in Southern Africa remain fragmented and underdeveloped. There's no comprehensive analysis of what makes mining incubators succeed. And probably one of my more fundamental identification of gaps is in the weak connection between entrepreneurship theory and mining practice. And finally, there's lack of a long-term and system-level studies in this particular area. So moving on to section number 3, my research methodology. Firstly, to design a qualitative multi-case research approach. My approach is qualitative and that of inductive multi-case design. I'm going to be focusing on the 3 integrators and serial mining entrepreneurs. My data sources are firstly primary through semi-structured interviews, and then triangulating that through archival filings and public records. My purpose is to generalize these theoretical patterns across diverse cases to discover context-specific themes. So how do I connect my research questions through to my methods, through to my outcomes? I've already illustrated my 3 research questions at the beginning of my presentation. I'm going to be doing a qualitative multiple case study analysis, which identifies strategic organization and other enablers. I'm going to be doing a comparative thematic analysis, which will help in developing a failure typology. Why do so many juniors actually fail, and why do so few actually succeed? And finally, a cross-case comparative analysis using the theories that I've generated from the literature review to create a conceptual business incubator framework and to build on what's come from the literature review itself. So how am I going to select and engage purposeful participants? I'm going to look at founders and executives with 2 or more commercial junior venture outcomes. The cohort is expected between 8 and 12. You'll see the little asterisks there that I've only been able to identify 12 living serial entrepreneurs, those who've had 2 or more junior success. Just shows how difficult this is. The rationale will be to capture contrasting national, cultural, institutional and capability context, and obviously there'll be ethical recruitment and consent as per Da Vinci protocols. So collecting and analyzing data through thematic triangulation. My primary method I've illustrated already, as of my secondary method. I'm going to triangulate this by combining the interview and archival evidence to strengthen the reliability of the analysis itself. And there'll be co-creation with the interactive dialogue between myself as the scholar, but also a practitioner in this area, to interpret lived experience. Thematic coding will be used to analyze the results, to look for recurring patterns and relationships across cases, and verification will be done by peer debriefing and secondary source comparison. I will ensure ethical integrity and research credibility by obviously following the ethical clearance process as per Da Vinci protocols. Informed consent, obviously, and don't forget, many of these people work in the public domain anyway, so will be subject to company law and stock exchange regulations. I acknowledge my own role in this environment, and therefore I will have to maintain high reflexivity throughout the whole process. And credibility will be gained through triangulation and participant validation. And finally, just skipping to the last point on this side, integrity will ensure that not only will I be adhering to Da Vinci protocols, but legal and listing regulations too as well. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, how am I going to demonstrate the theoretical and practical contribution of this study? Firstly, from a theoretical perspective, extending incubation theory by integrating organizational and network perspectives into an RBV-DC effectuation and bricolage synthesis for junior mining. Empirical, in comparing global with what's going on in Southern Africa, which happens to be fragmented and very little. A blueprint or a guide as for sector-specific incubation in Southern Africa. And potentially one of the greatest benefits of this is in the societal area: economic growth, contribution to sustainable development scenarios, employment, inclusive ownership, and local skill development, and not just by regulation. This is growing, hopefully, a strong cadre of African mining entrepreneurs. And then in conclusion, bridging theory and practice and advancing mining entrepreneur scholarship and leading, hopefully, to improving the success rate of juniors, thus more mines and thus economic growth. So my timeline is firstly, obviously, to pass this doctoral colloquium, submit and receive ethical clearance, conduct pilot interviews, the main data collection process, and then thematic analysis and draft results roughly in about 18 months' time. So thank you very much indeed for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and I open the floor for discussions and questions.